Sometimes the smallest requests can lead to the biggest changes. On a cold Chicago morning, a homeless man named James Walker gathered all his courage to ask Michael Jordan for a single dollar. What happened next would change not just his life, but the lives of countless others. This isn't a story about money. It's a story about second chances, the power of human connection, and how the greatest assists in life come when you least expect them. James Walker pulled his thin jacket tighter around his shoulders as the cold Chicago wind whipped down Michigan Avenue. His corner, as he had come to think of it over the past 8 months, sat between a coffee shop and a fancy clothing store. The smell of fresh coffee mixed with car exhaust made his empty stomach growl. It hadn't always been like this. Just 2 years ago, he stood in a high school gym, whistle around his neck, teaching kids how to dribble, shoot, and most importantly, believe in themselves. Coach Walker, that's what everyone called him back then. Now, most people didn't call him anything at all. They walked past without making eye contact, as if he were invisible. "Your team is like a family," he used to tell his players at Lincoln High, and family never gives up on each other. James smiled at the memory, then quickly wiped away a tear before anyone could see it. His team had been family, until the school board announced budget cuts, and Lincoln High closed its doors for good. He reached into his backpack, the same one he'd used to carry play diagrams and practice schedules, and pulled out an old photograph. 20 smiling faces looked back at him, his basketball team from their championship season. The edges of the photo were worn, but he kept it clean and safe in a plastic sleeve. "We did good that year, didn't we?" he whispered to the faces in the picture. They had won the state championship, the first time in Lincoln High's history. But the victory wasn't what made him most proud. It was watching his players grow, learn, and support each other through tough times. Tough times. James knew all about those now. After losing his coaching job, he'd found work at a warehouse. The pay wasn't great, but he and Sarah, his wife, had managed. Then Sarah got sick. Really sick. The kind of sick that meant lots of doctors, lots of medicine, and lots of bills. They'd sold their car first, then their house. They moved into a tiny apartment, and James picked up extra shifts at the warehouse. But it wasn't enough. The medical bills kept coming, and Sarah kept getting worse. When she passed away 6 months ago, James didn't just lose his wife, he lost his hope. The apartment went next, then his phone. Now home was wherever he could find a dry spot to sleep, and his possessions fit in one backpack. But he still had his Chicago Bulls cap, faded and worn but clean, just like his pride. A gust of wind sent paper cups rolling down the sidewalk. James watched as a mother hurried past, holding her daughter's hand tight. The little girl looked back at him, and for a moment, their eyes met. She reminded him of Monica, one of his players who'd started as the team's worst shooter but never gave up. By championship game, she'd scored the winning basket. "Keep practicing," he'd told Monica. Michael Jordan didn't become great by giving up when things got hard. Jordan. James had used MJ's stories countless times to inspire his team. The time Jordan got cut from his high school team, but worked harder instead of quitting. The famous flu game, when Jordan played through serious illness to win. Stories about never giving up, no matter what life threw at you. "Practice what you preach, old man," James muttered to himself, adjusting his position on the cold concrete. He had his own Jordan story now, but it wasn't one he was proud of. His cardboard sign read, "Anything helps," in careful letters. He'd considered writing more, about being a former coach, about Sarah, about losing everything, but in the end, fewer words felt more honest. The morning crowd rushed past, clutching coffee cups and phone screens. James had learned their patterns over the months. Early morning was business people, too busy to look down. Mid-morning brought shoppers, some who gave him sympathetic looks, occasionally $1 or $2. Afternoon was tourists, who sometimes stopped to ask for directions, treating him like a human being for a brief moment. Today felt different, though. There was a buzz in the air, more people than usual stopping outside the fancy clothing store next door. A black car with tinted windows had been parked across the street for 20 minutes, and men in suits kept checking their watches and phones. James sipped water from his bottle, trying to make it last. His stomach growled again, reminding him that yesterday's meal, a sandwich from a kind street vendor, was long gone. $1 could buy a hot dog from the cart down the street. $5 could get him a real meal at the diner that didn't mind serving people like him. The crowd near the clothing store grew larger. Camera phones appeared in people's hands. Whatever was about to happen, it was something big. Talentuji watched as more black cars pulled up, and men in suits and earpieces appeared. That's when he saw him. Even if James hadn't spent years teaching kids about Michael Jordan's career, he would have recognized that walk, that presence. The greatest basketball player of all time, walking down Michigan Avenue in a perfectly tailored suit, looking exactly like the larger-than-life figure from James's coaching days. Jordan moved with the same grace he'd shown on the court, though he was older now. A small group of business people walked with him, talking and gesturing about something important. They were headed straight for the clothing store, straight past James's corner. James's heart pounded. Here was the man whose examples had helped him inspire hundreds of kids over the years. The player whose perseverance story had given Monica the courage to keep shooting until she became a champion. The legend he'd quoted so many times. "I've failed over and over again in my life, and that is why I succeed." Now, James had his own story of failure. But the succeeding part? That was still a blank page. He looked at his empty cup, then at the approaching group. His hand trembled as he reached for the cup. Pride told him to stay quiet, to let Jordan pass like all the others. Hunger told him to speak up. As Jordan drew closer, James made his decision. He'd told his players that courage meant doing the hard thing, even when it scared you, even when it hurt your pride, even when you weren't sure how it would turn out. James cleared his throat and lifted his cup slightly. "Excuse me, Mr. Jordan," he said, his coach's voice barely a whisper now. "Can you spare $1?" Time seemed to freeze on Michigan Avenue. The world narrowed to just two people, a homeless former coach and the greatest basketball player who ever lived. Jordan's step faltered, just slightly, as James's words reached him. The business people around him kept walking for a few steps before realizing their leader had stopped. "Mr. Jordan, we're running late," one of the suits said, checking an expensive watch. But Jordan wasn't looking at his associates. His eyes were fixed on James, taking in every detail. James's hands shook as he held the cup. He felt small, smaller than he'd ever felt in his life. Even when he'd lost everything, he'd managed to keep his dignity. Now, asking his hero for a single dollar, that last bit of pride crumbled like autumn leaves. Jordan was taller in person than he appeared on TV, his presence filling the sidewalk like a shadow at sunset. His suit, probably cost more than James, had made in a year of coaching. The championship rings on his fingers caught the morning sunlight, sending tiny rainbows dancing across James's worn jeans. "Nice cap," Jordan said, his voice deeper than it sounded in old interviews. His eyes focused on the faded Bulls logo, studying it like a puzzle he was trying to solve. James touched the brim of his cap self-consciously. He'd kept it clean despite everything, washing it in bathroom sinks whenever he could. "Been a fan since '84, he managed to say. "Watched every game I could. Used to show the recordings to my team." He stopped himself. Jordan probably didn't want to hear his life story. The man had important places to be, important people to meet. Not some homeless guy on a street corner living in the past. "Your team?" Jordan asked. His business partners shifted impatiently behind him, but Jordan ignored them. His full attention was on James, with that same intensity he used to show on the court. "I was a coach," James said softly, lowering his cup. "High school basketball. Lincoln High, before they closed it down." His voice grew stronger as he remembered. "Had some great kids. Taught them about you, actually. About not giving up. About working through failure." A ghost of a smile crossed Jordan's face. "Lincoln High," he repeated. "They won state a few years back, didn't they?" James's heart skipped. "You remember that?" "I try to keep up with local basketball," Jordan said. "First championship in school history, wasn't it?" "Yes, sir," James said, sitting up straighter. For a moment, he wasn't a homeless man begging for money. He was Coach Walker again, talking basketball with Michael Jordan himself. "My girl Monica hit the winning shot. Three-pointer at the buzzer. She'd practiced that shot thousands of times. Used to come early, stay late. Like someone else we know," one of the business partners said, trying to move things along. But Jordan held up a hand, silencing him. "Tell me about the game," Jordan said. He didn't sit down. A man in a suit that expensive doesn't sit on sidewalks. But he shifted his weight, settling in to listen. A small crowd was gathering at a respectful distance, phones out, watching the strange scene unfold. James's coach voice came back, stronger with each word. "Down by 2, 8 seconds left. Other team had dominated the whole fourth quarter. My kids were tired, discouraged. During the timeout, I reminded them about your flu game. Told them that champions push through when things get hard." Jordan nodded. Everyone in Chicago knew about the flu game, when he'd played through severe illness to win a crucial playoff game. It was part of the legend. "Monica was having a rough night," James continued. "Couldn't hit anything. But when we needed that last shot," his voice cracked. "She didn't hesitate, just like we'd practiced. Catch, square up, release. Perfect. Form." He could see it all again. The ball arcing through the air, the crowd holding its breath, the clock hitting 0 as the ball dropped through the net. The explosion of joy, his players rushing the court, Monica buried under a pile of hugging teammates. "Where's Monica now?" Jordan asked. "College," James said proudly. "Basketball scholarship. She's studying engineering but still playing, still working harder than anyone else." "And you?" Jordan's eyes swept over James's ragged clothes, the cardboard sign, the corner he called home. "How does a championship coach end up here?" The brief return to his coaching days faded, and reality crashed back like a cold wave. James looked down at his empty cup, at his dirt-stained fingers. "Life throws harder shots than basketball sometimes," he said quietly. "And I couldn't make this one." Jordan was silent for a long moment. The crowd had grown larger, but they stayed back, sensing something important was happening. The business partners had stopped checking their watches, caught up in the conversation despite themselves. "Mr. Jordan," one of them finally said, "the store opening?" Jordan reached into his pocket. James's heart pounded. Was he really going to get that dollar? Would his hero, the man whose example had inspired so many of James's students, help him buy a meal? But Jordan didn't pull out his wallet. Instead, he took out his phone. James's heart sank as Jordan pulled out his phone. He'd seen this before. People pretending to make calls to avoid giving money, to avoid making eye contact, to avoid dealing with the uncomfortable reality of someone asking for help. His shoulders slumped. Even Michael Jordan, the man whose stories of perseverance had inspired so many of James's students, was going to brush him off. But Jordan didn't pretend to make a call. Instead, he started typing something, his fingers moving quickly across the screen. One of his business partners leaned over to look, eyebrows rising in surprise. "Sir," the man whispered, "are you sure about this?" Jordan nodded without looking up. The crowd around them had grown larger, but security guards kept people at a respectful distance. Phone cameras flashed. Tomorrow, James knew, there would be pictures all over the internet of Michael Jordan talking to a homeless man. He wondered what people would say about him. "Coach," Jordan said, looking up from his phone, "tell me something. If you could go back to coaching today, would you be ready?" The question caught James off guard. Ready? He hadn't run a practice in 2 years. His whistle was probably still in a box somewhere in a storage unit he could no longer afford. His playbook. But then he thought about Monica's game-winning shot, about the thousands of hours of practice that led to that moment, about all the life lessons he'd taught through basketball, about using Jordan's own stories to inspire kids to be their best selves. "Basketball isn't just a game," James said, his voice growing stronger. "It's a way to teach life, about teamwork, about pushing through hard times, about getting back up when you fall. Those lessons, they don't expire." Jordan smiled, a real smile, the kind that transformed his whole face. "That's exactly what I wanted to hear." He turned his phone around to show James the screen. At first, the words blurred through tears James didn't realize were forming. He blinked them away and read, "Youth Basketball Program Director needed. Immediate start. Experience with coaching and mentoring required." "There's a new community center opening next month on the south side," Jordan explained. "They need someone who understands basketball, but more importantly, someone who understands kids, someone who can teach them about more than just the game." James stared at the phone, then at Jordan, then back at the phone. His hands trembled so badly he had to clench them into fists. "Mr. Jordan, I don't have proper clothes for an interview. I don't have a phone. I don't have—" "You have experience," Jordan cut in. "You have heart, and you have someone willing to vouch for you." He gestured to himself with a slight grin. "Unless you think my recommendation won't carry much weight?" One of the business partners stepped forward, handing Jordan a business card. Jordan wrote something on the back before holding it out to James. "This is David Mitchell's number. He runs the community center. Call him tomorrow morning at 9. There's a phone at the shelter on Jackson Street. Tell him we talked." James reached for the card with shaking fingers. It felt impossibly heavy in his hand, like it carried the weight of all his hopes, all his dreams of getting back to coaching, of having a purpose again. "The position includes temporary housing until you get back on your feet," Jordan continued. "It's not much, but it's a start, a chance to rebuild, to make a difference again." He paused, looking James directly in the eyes. "The question is, are you ready to take your shot?" James thought about all the times he'd used Jordan's stories to inspire his players. About the flu game, about getting cut from his high school team, about failing over and over but never giving up. Now here was Jordan himself, offering not just $1, but a chance at redemption. "Yes, sir," James said, standing up straighter despite his worn clothes and tired body. "I'm ready." Jordan nodded, satisfied. Good. Because those kids are going to need someone who understands both victory and defeat. Someone who can teach them that it's not about how many times you fall. It's about how many times you get back. Up, James finished, his coach's voice returning fully for the first time in 2 years. The business partners were checking their watches again, more urgently now. The crowd had grown even larger, and James could hear whispers, see phones recording every moment. But none of that mattered. What mattered was the card in his hand, the spark of hope in his heart, and the fact that Michael Jordan, the man whose example had helped him inspire so many others, had just helped inspire him to take one more shot. Jordan reached out and adjusted the brim of James's old Bulls cap. "Keep that clean," he said with a wink. "You're going to need it for practice." Then he turned to his waiting partners. "All right, let's go open that store." As Jordan walked away, followed by his entourage and the drifting crowd, James sat back down on his corner. But something was different now. His cardboard sign lay forgotten beside him. In his hands, he held not an empty cup asking for dollars, but a business card offering a future. He looked up at the sky, thinking about Sarah, about his old team, about Monica and her championship shot. "Sometimes," he whispered, "the best assists come when you least expect them." James sat on his corner for a long time after Jordan left, holding the business card as carefully as if it were made of glass. People walked by, some pointing and whispering. They'd seen what happened, or heard from others who had. A few even dropped money in his cup, but James hardly noticed. His mind was racing through memories, each one feeling closer now, more real than they had in years. Teaching Kevin how to perfect his jump shot, helping Maria overcome her fear of driving to the basket, late nights in the gym, the rhythmic bounce of basketballs echoing off empty bleachers. "Excuse me," a soft voice said, breaking through his thoughts. "Are you the coach who just talked to Michael Jordan?" James looked up to see a woman in a barista's apron from the coffee shop next door. She held out a steaming cup and a paper bag. "I saw what happened. Thought you might like some breakfast while you wait for tomorrow morning." The smell of fresh coffee and warm pastries made his stomach growl. "Thank you," he said, accepting her kindness with a nod. "I'm James Walker." "I know," she smiled. "I mean, I heard. Everyone's talking about it online already. They're calling it the dollar that changed everything." James took a sip of coffee. Real coffee, not the watered-down stuff from convenience stores, and felt warmth spread through his body. "I didn't even get the dollar," he chuckled, then grew serious. "Got something better. A chance." The barista, her name tag read Jenny, sat down next to him on the sidewalk, not caring about her clean apron. "Tell me about your team," she said. "The championship one. I'd love to hear about them." So James told her. About Monica's winning shot, yes, but also about the smaller victories. The shy kid who found his voice calling plays. The girl who learned to stand up to bullies by standing tall on the court. The boy who improved his grades because James made good schoolwork a condition for playing time. As he talked, more people stopped to listen. A businessman in a suit sat down on a nearby bench, his morning meeting forgotten. A group of teenagers paused their conversation, drawn in by the stories. Even the hot dog vendor pushed his cart closer to hear. "We weren't just a team," James explained, warming to his audience. "We were a family. That's what I always told them. On this court, we look out for each other. We lift each other up. We celebrate each other's victories and help each other through tough times." "Like Jordan helped you today?" Jenny asked. James nodded, touching the business card in his pocket. "You know what's funny? I used to tell my Kids, that you never know when your moment will come. That you have to stay ready, stay true to who you are. I told them Jordan's story about getting cut from his high school team, how he used that disappointment to fuel his determination. He paused, looking at his worn shoes, his ragged clothes. I lost sight of that myself these past couple years, lost sight of a lot of things. But maybe that's part of the lesson too. Maybe sometimes you need to fall all the way down before you can understand what it really means to get back up. A young boy in the growing crowd raised his hand like he was in class. "Did you really win state?" he asked. "What was it like?" James's face lit up. This was what he lived for, sharing the joy of the game, the lessons it could teach. For the next hour, he told stories. About the championship game, yes, but also about the practices, the failures, the times his team faced adversity and grew stronger. People came and went, but there was always someone listening. They brought him more coffee, sandwiches, even a new notebook when he mentioned wanting to start writing down plays again. But more than the food or supplies, they gave him something he'd lost months ago. An audience, a purpose, a chance to teach. In basketball, he told them, positioning is everything. You have to know where you are on the court, where your teammates are, where you need to be next. But sometimes in life, you lose your position. You get knocked down, pushed out of bounds. The trick is remembering that the game isn't over until the final buzzer. And your buzzer hasn't sounded yet, has it, Coach? Jenny asked with a smile. James touched his Bulls cap, the one Jordan himself had adjusted, and felt tears in his eyes. "No," he said softly. "No, it hasn't. Tomorrow morning at 9, I get to call a play I never thought I'd have a chance. To run again." As afternoon turned to evening, the crowd thinned. Jenny had to go back to work, but not before making sure James knew he could use the coffee shop's bathroom to clean up before his phone call tomorrow. Others left him their well wishes, and a few even asked if he'd let them know how the call went. For the first time in months, James didn't worry about where he would sleep or what he would eat. The coffee shop owner had slipped him a gift card, with enough for meals for several days. Someone had brought him a warm coat. Another person gave him a prepaid phone card for his call tomorrow. But more than the physical gifts, they had given him back his dignity. They had listened to him not as a homeless man, but as Coach Walker. They had seen him not for where he was, but for who he was, and who he could be again. As the sun set over Chicago, James took out the photograph of his championship team. Their young faces smiled up at him, full of hope and pride. He remembered what he'd told them after they won state. This isn't the end. It's just the beginning of something bigger. He hadn't known then how true those words would become, or how they would come back to him on a cold morning when he gathered the courage to ask Michael Jordan for $1. Looking at the business card one more time, James smiled. Tomorrow would be game day, and Coach Walker intended to be ready. The shelter on Jackson Street was already busy when James arrived the next morning. He'd woken before dawn, used the coffee, shop bathroom to clean up, and made sure his Bulls cap was spotless. Jenny had been there early, giving him a fresh coffee and a muffin, along with a hug that brought tears to his eyes. "You've got this, Coach," she'd said, straightening his collar like a mother sending her child off to school. Now, sitting in the shelter's waiting area, James watched the clock tick toward 9 o'clock. The phone card felt heavy in his pocket, right next to Jordan's business card. A shelter worker had told him he could use the office phone for an important call. News about James's encounter with Jordan had spread fast. At exactly 8:59, James picked up the phone. His hands shook as he dialed the number on the card. 1. Ring. 2 rings. 3. "David Mitchell speaking," a warm voice answered. James took a deep breath. Mr. Mitchell, this is James Walker. Michael Jordan asked me to call you about the youth basketball program director position. There was a pause, then a chuckle. Ah, the famous Coach Walker. I've been expecting your call. In fact, I got quite a few calls about you yesterday. Michael, Jordan, of course, but also a Monica Rodriguez? Said she's a former player of yours? James's heart skipped. Monica had called? How had she even known? Social media moves fast, Coach, Mitchell explained, as if reading his thoughts. That video of you and Jordan went viral. Monica saw it and tracked me down. Told me all about that championship game, about how you taught her more than just basketball. Said she wouldn't be where she is today without you. Tears welled in James's eyes. All those lessons, all those early mornings and late nights in the gym. They hadn't just been about winning games. They'd been about building character, about teaching life skills that lasted long after the final buzzer. There's more, Mitchell continued. We've had calls from other former players, from teachers at Lincoln High, even from parents. Seems like you made quite an impact, Coach Walker. James couldn't speak. He'd spent so long feeling invisible, feeling like all his years of coaching had disappeared like morning mist. But his players had remembered. They'd carried his lessons with them. The job's yours if you want it, Mitchell said. We can sort out the paperwork later today. The housing isn't fancy, just a small apartment above the community center, but it's clean, it's warm, and it's yours for as long as you need it. Yes, James managed to say. Yes, I want it. Good. Because we've already got kids signing up. Word spread fast about the championship coach coming to run the program. You've got 20 kids already registered, including Monica's little sister. James had to sit down. Monica's sister? The last time he'd seen her, she'd been a tiny thing, always bouncing a basketball too big for her hands, wanting to be just like her big sister. There's one more thing, Mitchell added. Michael Jordan made a personal donation to the program. Enough for new equipment, uniforms, everything we need. But he had one condition, that we name the court after someone special. James waited, his heart pounding. He wants to call it Sarah Walker Court, Mitchell said softly. Said you'd understand why. The tears came freely now. Sarah had never missed a game, had always believed in what James was trying to do with his players. Even when she was sick, she'd talk about the day he'd coach again. When can I start? James asked, wiping his eyes. How about today? Come by at noon. We'll get the paperwork done, show you your apartment, and you can see the court. It needs some work, but it's perfect, James said. Everything's perfect. After hanging up, James sat in the shelter's office for a long moment. Through the window, he could see the Chicago morning sun painting the city gold. Somewhere out there, his old players were going about their lives, carrying his lessons with them. Monica was probably in class, maybe thinking about her little sister following in her footsteps. He touched his Bulls cap, remembering Jordan's words. Keep that clean. You're going to need it for practice. Practice. The word filled him with energy he hadn't felt in years. He had plays to design, drills to plan, lives to touch. But first, he had something important to do. James walked back to his corner one last time. Jenny was waiting outside the coffee shop with a small crowd. Word about his phone call had spread. When they saw his smile, they started cheering. I got the job, he announced, and the cheer grew louder. Jenny hugged him again. The hot dog vendor gave him a thumbs up. Even the businessman from yesterday, passing by on his way to work, stopped to shake his hand. James picked up his backpack, still containing his team photo and now a few new supplies given by well-wishers, and took one last look at his corner. He'd hit rock bottom here, lost his last shred of pride here, and found redemption here. "Need a ride to the community center?" Jenny asked. "My brother's got a car. He'd be happy to take you." James smiled, touching the business card in his pocket, one last time before putting it safely away. "Thank you for everything." As they drove through Chicago's streets, James thought about all the kids he'd get to coach, all the lives he'd get to touch, all the lessons he'd get to teach, not just about basketball, but about life, about falling down and getting back up, about second chances and the courage to take them. And he thought about that dollar he'd asked for, the dollar he never got. Because Michael Jordan had given him something far more valuable, a chance to be Coach Walker again. The community center appeared ahead, a solid brick building with kids already gathering outside. James could see the basketball court through a chain-link fence. It needed work, yes, but he could already picture it. Sarah Walker Court, where dreams would be born, where lessons would be learned, where lives would be changed. Just like his had been, all because he found the courage to ask for a dollar. 6 months later, James stood at center court, his whistle shining against his new Chicago Bulls jacket, a gift from his players. The sound of bouncing basketballs filled the gym as kids warmed up for practice. The court gleamed under fresh paint and new lights, and the name Sarah Walker Court stood proud on the wall. "Coach," called a voice he'd know anywhere. Monica Rodriguez walked through the gym doors, home from college for the weekend. Her little sister Maria broke away from practice to run and hug her. "Look who's here to help with practice," James announced to his team. The kids gathered around, eyes wide. They'd all heard the story of Monica's championship shot. Some had even watched the video. It was part of James's lessons about never giving up. "Show them the ring, Monica," James said with a smile. Monica pulled out her championship ring, letting it catch the light. "Coach Walker taught me everything I know," she told the young players. "Not just about basketball, but about life. About getting back up when you fall down. About taking your shot even when you're scared." James watched as his new players crowded around Monica, asking questions about the championship game, about what it felt like to make that winning shot. Maria beamed with pride at her big sister. These days, she was working on her own three-pointer, staying late after practice just like Monica used to. The gym doors opened again, and James turned to see David Mitchell walking in with a special guest. The kids fell silent as Michael Jordan himself stepped onto Sarah Walker Court. "Thought I'd stop by," Jordan said with that famous smile. "See how my favorite coach is doing." The kids were awestruck, but James just smiled and shook Jordan's hand. These days, it felt natural. Jordan had become a regular visitor to the program, sometimes bringing other Bulls legends to help with practice. "We're doing great," James said. "These kids, they're something special." Jordan looked around the gym, at the new equipment he'd donated, at the kids wearing their fresh uniforms, at the championship banner James had brought from Lincoln High. "Tell them the story, Coach," he said. "They should know how all this started." The kids gathered around, sitting on the court. Even Monica sat down, though she'd heard the story before. Jordan leaned against the wall, nodding for James to begin. "For 6 months ago," James started, "I was homeless. I'd lost everything. My job, my house, my hope. I was sitting on a street corner, asking for spare change. And then one day, I saw Michael Jordan walking past. He touched his Bulls cap, the same one he'd been wearing that day. I asked him for $1, just $1. But sometimes the things we ask for aren't the things we really need." "What happened next, Coach?" one of the younger kids asked, even though they all knew the story. "Mr. Jordan didn't give me $1. James said, smiling at the memory. Instead, he gave me something much more valuable. He gave me a chance to be a coach again, a chance to make a difference in young lives again. Like you did with me, Monica added, hugging her sister. The funny thing is, James continued, I thought I was just asking for money for a meal, but I was really asking for help. And sometimes, when you find the courage to ask for help, you discover that people are waiting to give it. Not just Mr. Jordan, but the whole community. He looked around at his team, his new family. Every day, I teach these kids about basketball. But more importantly, I teach them what I learned that morning on Michigan Avenue. That it's okay to ask for help. That second chances are possible. That giving up is never the answer. Jordan stepped forward. Show them what's in your office, Coach. James walked to his office and came back with 2 framed items. The first was the photograph of his Lincoln High championship team. The second was newer, a screenshot of the viral video of him and Jordan printed with the caption that had spread across the internet. The dollar that changed everything. I keep these here to remind me, James said, that every ending can be a new beginning. That every fall can lead to a greater rise. That sometimes the biggest assists in life come from unexpected places. He looked at his players, past and present, at Monica, who had trusted his lessons all the way to a championship, at Maria, working to follow in her sister's footsteps, at all the new young faces, eager to learn not just about basketball, but about life. You want to know the real truth? James said, his voice strong and clear. That morning, when I asked Michael Jordan for $1, I thought I had nothing left to give. I thought my coaching days were over. I thought my chance to make a difference was gone. He paused, looking at Jordan, who nodded encouragingly. But I was wrong, James continued, because every one of you sitting here today is proof that we always have something to give. Every bounce of the ball in this gym is proof that second chances are real. Every practice, every game, every lesson is proof that it's never too late to start again. Jordan stepped to center court. Let's show these kids how it's done, Coach. How about a little one-on-one? The kids cheered as James took off his whistle. He might not win against the greatest player of all time, but that wasn't the point. The point was showing his team that you take your shot, even when the odds are against you. Just like he had that morning, when he found the courage to ask for $1 and received a future instead. Game on, James said, and Sarah Walker Court came alive with the sound of basketball and laughter, of dreams being born and lives being changed, of a story that would be told for years to come. The story of a coach who lost everything but his love for the game. The story of a legend who saw more than just a homeless man asking for money. And that's the incredible story of how asking for $1 changed everything. Where are you watching this from? Write your city in the comments. I'd love to know how far this story has traveled. If it touched your heart, don't forget to hit that like button. Sometimes the smallest gestures, like Jordan's response to James, can make the biggest difference. Thanks for being part of this story today.